I said save your story for the station, kid.
Elijah? Mom?
The afternoon sun of a placid Tuesday baked the asphalt of the parking lot, casting long shadows from the gas pumps outside the Bright Mart convenience store. Inside, the air conditioning hummed a steady, monotonous tune, a stark contrast to the simmering unease brewing inside Officer Darren Miller. At 32, Miller still had the lean build of his academy days, but a certain hardness had settled in his eyes over his 8 years on the force. It was a look that saw potential threats lurking behind every ordinary interaction, a professional paranoia that his supervisors called good instincts, but was in reality a mosaic of unexamined prejudices. He had been cruising the quiet suburban streets of Northwood, a neighborhood where manicured lawns and two-car garages were the norm, when a call for a routine wellness check had brought him to this particular strip mall. The check had been a false alarm, but as he pulled away, his gaze snagged on the Bright Mart. Something felt off. It wasn't a tangible thing he could articulate for a report, not a broken window or a frantic customer. It was a feeling, a prickle on the back of his neck that he had learned to trust implicitly. From his patrol car, he saw the lone figure behind the counter through the large plate glass window, a young black man. Miller's internal calculus began its familiar grim arithmetic. The neighborhood was predominantly white. The kid looked young, maybe 19 or 20, wearing a slightly too large red polo shirt, the store's uniform, and a black baseball cap pulled low. To an objective observer, he was simply an employee at his post. To Officer Miller, he was an anomaly, a variable that didn't fit the equation of this sleepy suburban afternoon. Miller's hand tightened on the steering wheel. He told himself it was just due diligence, a quick look-see to make sure everything was on the level. He had a sixth sense for these things. He'd seen it a dozen times. The lookout, the inside man, the one who pretends to belong right before everything goes sideways. He parked the cruiser at the far end of the lot, the spot least visible from the storefront. He didn't flip on his lights or siren. This was about observation, about catching something in its natural state. He got out of the car, the humid air hitting him like a blanket, the reassuring weight of his equipment belt, the Glock, the taser, the cuffs, was a familiar comfort. He walked with a deliberate, measured pace, his eyes locked on the figure inside. The young man, Elijah Davis, was meticulously straightening a display of candy bars near the register. He was 19, a sophomore at the local community college, majoring in business administration. This job was his way of saving for a 4-year university, a means to an end. It was boring, mind-numbing work, but it paid the bills. He was humming a tune he'd heard on the radio, his mind on a paper he needed to write for his economics class, when the bell above the door chimed. Elijah looked up, his customer service smile already forming. "Welcome to Bright Mart, how can I—" The words died in his throat. The man standing there wasn't a customer. He was a police officer, and his eyes were not friendly. They were scanning the store, not with the casual glance of someone looking for a soda, but with the intense, penetrating stare of a predator assessing its territory. The officer's gaze swept past the aisles of chips, the refrigerated section, and then settled on Elijah. It was a look that stripped him of his uniform, his name tag, his very identity as an employee, and replaced it with a single, damning label: suspect. Elijah felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He'd been given the talk by his mother 100 times. Be polite, keep your hands visible, don't make any sudden moves, answer clearly, survive the encounter. Officer Miller walked towards the counter, his steps silent and purposeful. He didn't greet Elijah. He simply stopped a few feet away, his hand resting casually on his belt, near his firearm. "Quiet afternoon," Miller stated, his voice flat. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation disguised as an observation. Elijah swallowed, forcing his voice to remain steady. "Yes, sir. It usually is around this time." He kept his hands flat on the counter, just as his mother had taught him. Miller's eyes narrowed. The kid's calmness seemed unnatural, rehearsed. It was the kind of calm someone puts on when they're trying to hide something. "You work here?" Miller asked, his tone laced with disbelief. He glanced at the red polo shirt, dismissing it. Anyone could get a uniform. "Yes, sir. My name is Elijah. I'm the afternoon shift manager." Miller let out a short, humorless huff. "Shift manager? You look a little young to be a manager." The condescension was thick, designed to provoke, to get a reaction. Elijah refused to take the bait. "Mr. Henderson, the owner, trusts me. I've been working here for over a year." This explanation seemed to irritate Miller further. The story was too neat, too clean. His gut was screaming that something was wrong. His eyes darted to the cash register. It was closed. "I want to see your hands, away from the counter," Miller commanded, his voice dropping an octave, losing all pretense of casualness. Elijah's heart began to pound against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat of fear. He had done everything right, yet the situation was escalating. He slowly raised his hands, palms facing forward. "Sir, I'm just doing my job. What is this about?" Miller ignored the question. His focus was absolute. In his mind, the scenario was playing out clearly. This kid was waiting for the right moment, maybe for a partner, to clean out the register. He was stalling. "Turn around. Place your hands behind your back." The command was cold, final. Elijah's mind reeled. This couldn't be happening. "Officer, please," he pleaded, his voice cracking slightly. "I'm the only one here. You can call the owner. His number is right here on the—" He gestured with his head toward a business card taped to the register. That was the last straw for Miller. The mention of calling someone else was a classic diversion tactic. It was time to end this. He closed the distance in 2 quick strides, grabbing Elijah's arm with a grip of steel. The cold, unforgiving metal of the handcuffs bit into Elijah's wrists. The sharp clink-clink of the ratchet mechanism echoed in the silent convenience store, a sound that would later haunt his nightmares. It was a sound of finality, the sound of his freedom being stripped away based on nothing more than a police officer's baseless suspicion. "You have the right to remain silent," Miller began, reciting the Miranda warning in a detached, robotic tone as he roughly maneuvered Elijah's arms behind his back. The words were a surreal overlay to the reality of the situation. He was being arrested in his own place of work for a crime that existed only in the officer's imagination. Panic began to claw at the edges of Elijah's composure. "Officer, you are making a huge mistake," he said, his voice strained but steady. He focused on his mother's words, a mantra of survival. "Don't resist. Don't argue. Just state the facts." "My name is Elijah Davis. I am an employee of this store. My ID is in my wallet in my back pocket. The owner's number is on the counter. You can verify everything right now." Miller scoffed, giving the cuffs a final, painful tug to ensure they were secure. "Everyone's got a story, kid. I'll hear yours down at the station." To Miller, every plea of innocence was just part of the script he'd come to expect. Denial was the first chapter. He saw Elijah not as a 19-year-old college student, but as a textbook perpetrator caught in the act. The calm demeanor was a cover for cunning. The rational explanations were a desperate attempt to talk his way out of a corner. Miller felt a surge of professional satisfaction. He had trusted his gut, and it had paid off. He had neutralized a potential threat before it could escalate into a robbery or worse. This would look good on his report. Proactive, vigilant. He began to march Elijah toward the front door, one hand firmly on the young man's shoulder. Elijah stumbled, his work-issued non-slip shoes squeaking on the linoleum floor. The humiliation was a physical weight pressing down on him, stealing the air from his lungs. He could see their reflection in the glass of the cooler doors, a white officer, tall and imposing, and a young black man in handcuffs, his head bowed. It was a scene as old as America itself, a tableau of power and prejudice. He thought of his mother. What would she think? She was so proud of him, of his work ethic, his grades, his determination to build a better life. Now he was being treated like a common criminal, his dignity discarded on the floor of a convenience store next to a rack of potato chips. The injustice of it all burned like acid in his chest. "Please," Elijah whispered, a final desperate appeal, "just listen to me." Miller's response was to push him forward. "Save it," he grunted. They were just a few feet from the door when the bell chimed again, its cheerful, tinkling sound a bizarre counterpoint to the tense drama unfolding within. Both Miller and Elijah turned their heads. Standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the bright afternoon sun, was a woman in a sharply tailored navy blue uniform. She had a leather briefcase in one hand and a set of keys in the other. Her eyes, sharp and intelligent, took in the scene in a fraction of a second. The empty store, the officer holding a young man in handcuffs, the look of fear and desperation on the young man's face. And then her eyes locked with Elijah's. A flicker of disbelief, then horror, then a cold, hard fury that seemed to drop the temperature in the room by 20 degrees. The nameplate on her uniform was polished to a high sheen, the silver letters catching the light. It read, Davis. Officer Miller's brain, which had been running on a self-congratulatory high, screeched to a halt. He recognized her instantly. Every officer in the Northwood Police Department recognized her. She was his boss. She was the chief of police. For a moment, he was paralyzed by confusion. What was the chief doing here? Was this a test? A surprise inspection? His mind scrambled to connect the dots, but they refused to form a coherent picture. He tightened his grip on Elijah's arm, a reflexive assertion of his authority even as a profound sense of dread began to creep up his spine. The chief of police, a formidable woman who had earned her position through decades of impeccable service and a reputation for being tough but fair, took a slow step into the store. She didn't look at Miller. Her gaze was fixed entirely on the young man in his custody. Her voice when she spoke was dangerously quiet, each word laced with a mixture of maternal anguish and iron command. "Elijah," she said, her voice a mixture of a question and a statement. Elijah's shoulders sagged with a wave of relief so immense it almost buckled his knees. "Mom!" he choked out, the single word carrying the weight of his entire ordeal. The briefcase slipped from Chief Davis's hand, hitting the floor with a dull, heavy thud. The sound broke the spell. Officer Miller's mind finally, belatedly connected the last two catastrophic dots. Davis, Elijah Davis, Chief Davis. He looked from the chief's stricken face to the terrified eyes of the young man in his custody. He wasn't just some kid. He wasn't a suspect. He was her son. The full, horrifying weight of what he had done crashed down on him. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The air grew thin and hard to breathe. He was holding the son of the chief of police in handcuffs, having accused him of being a robber in his own place of employment. He had not just made a mistake. He had committed an act of career suicide so spectacular, so profoundly idiotic, that there was no coming back from it. His hand, which had been gripping Elijah's arm so tightly, went numb. He let go as if he'd been burned, taking a clumsy step back. The silence that filled the store was no longer quiet. It was a screaming, deafening void, filled with the magnitude of his colossal error. Time itself seemed to warp in the small, brightly lit convenience store. The hum of the refrigerators, the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights, the distant sound of traffic outside. It all faded into a dull, roaring silence that filled Officer Miller's head. He stood frozen, his hand still hovering in the air where Elijah's arm had been moments before. His mind was a maelstrom of denial and panic. This had to be a nightmare, a stress-induced hallucination. The chief of police, his ultimate superior, couldn't possibly be the mother of the suspect he had just arrested. The odds were astronomical. But the look on her face, a terrifying blend of cold professional rage and raw maternal pain, was undeniably real. Chief Evelyn Davis remained in the doorway, her posture rigid. She had come to the Bright Mart to pick up her son, a small ritual they had on Tuesdays when her meetings finished early. She was going to surprise him, maybe take him out for an early dinner. Instead, she had walked into this. Her son, her brilliant, gentle, hard-working Elijah, being treated like a criminal by one of her own officers. Her training, honed over 25 years of law enforcement, kicked in, creating a thin wall of composure over the volcano of emotion erupting inside her. Her eyes, which had been fixed on Elijah, slowly, deliberately moved to Officer Miller. Miller felt her gaze land on him like a physical blow. He had never been the direct focus of the chief's attention before. He had seen her at roll calls, in department-wide meetings, a respected figure at a professional distance. Now that distance was gone, and he was exposed under the full, unblinking glare of her authority. And it was terrifying. He could see the gears turning behind her eyes as she processed the scene, her mind piecing together the narrative of what had led to this moment. She saw his defensive posture, the cuffs on her son's wrists, the triumphant look that had likely been on his face just moments before she arrived. She saw everything. "Officer Miller," she said. Her voice was devoid of warmth, clipped and precise. It was the voice she used when a major crime had been committed, the voice of command that cut through chaos. Hearing his own name from her lips in that tone sent a jolt of pure fear through Miller. He felt his mouth go dry. He tried to speak, to explain, but no words would come. What could he possibly say? "Chief, I apologize. I mistook your son for a potential felon based on a vague feeling and the color of his skin." The absurdity, the sheer indefensibility of his actions rendered him mute. Elijah, still standing with his hands cuffed behind his back, finally broke the silence. "Mom, he wouldn't listen," he said, his voice trembling with a mixture of relief and residual fear. "I told him I worked here. I told him to call my boss. He wouldn't listen." Each word was a nail in Miller's professional coffin. He hadn't followed protocol. He hadn't de-escalated. He hadn't investigated. He had jumped straight from suspicion to enforcement, bypassing every procedural safeguard designed to prevent exactly this kind of catastrophic error. He had let his bias be his guide, and it had led him off a cliff. Chief Davis took another step into the store. She walked past Miller as if he were a piece of furniture and went directly to her son. Her professional mask cracked for a moment, and the mother took over. Her hand gently touched Elijah's cheek. "Are you okay? Did he hurt you?" she asked, her voice soft now, filled with concern. "I'm okay, just scared," Elijah admitted. The chief's eyes fell to the steel cuffs circling his wrists, and the cold fury returned, harder than before. She turned her head slowly, her gaze once again pinning a stunned Officer Miller to the spot. "The key, officer," she commanded, her voice like ice. "Now!" Miller fumbled at his belt, his fingers suddenly clumsy and uncooperative. The small, grooved key felt alien in his trembling hand. He felt like a rookie, like a child being scolded for breaking a precious vase. He moved toward Elijah, his movements stiff and awkward. The simple act of unlocking the handcuffs felt impossibly complex under the chief's watchful eye. He avoided looking at either of them, focusing instead on the lock mechanism. The first cuff sprang open with a click, then the second. The sound of the metal releasing was as loud as a gunshot in the tense silence. Elijah immediately brought his hands around to his front, rubbing his wrists where the serrated edges of the cuffs had left angry red marks. He took a half step back, putting distance between himself and Miller, and moved closer to his mother, seeking the safety she represented. Chief Davis put a protective arm around her son's shoulders. The tableau was now complete. The victim and his protector on one side, the disgraced officer on the other. The power dynamic had been completely, irrevocably inverted. Miller was no longer the agent of the state, the arbiter of suspicion. He was just a man who had made a terrible, career-ending mistake and was now standing before the two people who would be the architects of his downfall. He finally found his voice, a pathetic, strangled whisper. "Chief, I can explain." Chief Davis cut him off with a sharp, dismissive gesture. "You will have plenty of time to explain, Miller," she said, her voice dripping with contempt. "You will explain it to Internal Affairs. You will explain it to the city attorney. You will explain it in your formal written statement, which you will begin working on the second you get back to the precinct." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. "Your patrol is over. Get back to the station, and do not speak to anyone about this until you are instructed to do so. Is that understood?" "Yes, Chief," Miller managed to choke out. It was the only thing he could say. He backed away slowly, like a defeated animal, turned, and walked out of the store. The cheerful chime of the door sounded like a death knell. He got into his cruiser, the interior suddenly feeling claustrophobic. He sat for a long moment, staring at his own reflection in the rearview mirror, but he didn't recognize the man staring back. In the span of 10 minutes, he had gone from a confident, proactive cop to a pariah, a walking liability. And he knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that his life would never be the same. Once the door chimed, signaling Officer Miller's departure, the rigid posture of Chief Evelyn Davis dissolved. The weight of her uniform, her rank, and her responsibility seemed to momentarily vanish, replaced by the overwhelming instincts of a mother. She pulled Elijah into a tight embrace, holding him as if to physically shield him from the trauma that had just invaded their lives. He leaned into her, the adrenaline that had kept him steady finally draining away, leaving behind a profound, trembling exhaustion. He was safe now, but the violation lingered. The feeling of the cold steel on his wrists, the sting of being presumed guilty without evidence, the sheer powerlessness. Those were wounds that a key and an apology could not instantly heal. "It's okay, baby, it's over now."
I'm here.
Evelyn whispered into his hair, her own voice thick with emotion she dared not show just moments before. She could feel the rapid, frantic beat of his heart against her chest. This was her son, the boy she had raised to be respectful, to work hard, to believe in the fundamental fairness of the world. And a man under her own command had shattered that belief in a matter of minutes. The rage she felt was a pure, white-hot fire, but it was tangled with a deep, aching guilt. This happened on her watch. It was her department, her officer, her failure. After a long moment, she gently pulled back, her hands on his shoulders, her eyes scanning him for any sign of physical injury. She saw the raw, red marks on his wrists. Each one felt like a personal indictment. "Let's get out of here," she said, her voice regaining a sliver of its usual command. "You need to lock up." Elijah nodded, still looking dazed. He moved mechanically through the familiar routine of closing the store, his hands shaking slightly as he counted the cash in the register and secured it in the safe. Evelyn watched him, her heart aching with every movement. She saw not just a 19-year-old employee, but a young black man who had just received a brutal, first-hand lesson in how quickly the world could turn against him, how easily his identity could be erased and replaced by a stereotype. The drive from the Bright Mart to their home was heavy with a silence that was more profound than any words. Elijah stared out the passenger window, the familiar suburban streets looking alien and menacing. Evelyn gripped the steering wheel, her mind racing. She was no longer just a mother, she was the chief of police again, and a crisis was unfolding. She knew the protocol. An incident involving an officer and a civilian, especially one with this kind of explosive potential, would trigger a cascade of actions. Internal affairs would have to be notified immediately. A formal investigation would be launched. Statements would be taken. But this was different. The civilian was her son. Her involvement created a conflict of interest so massive it threatened to compromise the entire investigation before it even began. When they arrived home, the moment they stepped inside, the carefully constructed dam of Elijah's composure finally broke. He sat down on the living room sofa and buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The fear, the humiliation, the anger, it all came pouring out. Evelyn sat beside him, her arm around him, letting him cry. There were no words of comfort that felt adequate. "I did everything you told me to," he said between sobs, his voice muffled. "I was polite. I kept my hands visible. I didn't argue, and he still looked at me like I was nothing." Her heart fractured. Those lessons, the ones she had taught him for his own protection, had failed. The system she had dedicated her life to, the system she now led, had failed him. Later that evening, after Elijah had retreated to his room, exhausted and emotionally drained, Evelyn sat in her home office, the weight of the world on her shoulders. Her phone buzzed incessantly with calls and texts from her deputy chief, the head of internal affairs, the city manager. The wheels of the bureaucracy were turning. She picked up the phone and made the first of many difficult calls. Her voice was pure steel, the chief in full command. "Deputy Chief Reynolds," she began, "there has been an incident involving Officer Darren Miller. I am recusing myself from the chain of command regarding this investigation, effective immediately. Captain Davies from Internal Affairs will take the lead and report directly to you. I want a preliminary report on my desk by 0800 tomorrow." She was drawing a line, creating a firewall between her role as mother and her role as chief. But she knew it was a flimsy, transparent barrier. The entire department would know the truth by morning. The narrative would spin out of control. Some would see it as a clear case of racial profiling. Others, particularly within the powerful police union, would rush to defend Miller, painting him as a diligent officer who made a good-faith mistake. They would try to dig into Elijah's past, looking for anything, a speeding ticket, a youthful indiscretion, to tarnish his image and justify Miller's suspicion. The thought filled her with a cold dread. She had to protect her son, not just physically and emotionally, but from the institutional machine that was now grinding into gear, a machine designed, above all else, to protect its own. She knew the standard internal affairs investigation would be insufficient. It would be an internal review, conducted by officers investigating one of their own. It was a system inherently biased towards protecting the department from liability. They would interview Miller, who would craft a story of perceived threats and suspicious behavior. They would interview Elijah, but his testimony would be weighed against that of a sworn officer. It would become a he said situation, and in those situations, the badge often carried more weight than the truth. Evelyn stared at the seal of the Northwood Police Department on her wall. For the first time in her long and storied career, she felt like an outsider in her own house. She realized with chilling certainty that to get real justice for her son, she couldn't rely on the system she led. She would have to fight it. The following morning, the Northwood Police Department was a hornet's nest of hushed conversations and nervous energy. The rumor mill had worked overnight, twisting the facts of the incident at the Bright Mart into a dozen different versions, each more sensational than the last. Officer Miller had been placed on administrative leave, a standard procedure that felt anything but standard in this case. He had spent hours with his union representative, meticulously crafting his official statement. In his version of events, Elijah had been acting suspiciously, his movements furtive and evasive. He claimed Elijah had been uncooperative, that his hands had been near the register in a way that suggested he was about to make a move. He painted himself as a vigilant officer who had made a split-second judgment call in a potentially high-stakes situation. It was a narrative built on subjective interpretations and veiled accusations, designed to create just enough reasonable doubt to muddy the waters. Deputy Chief Mark Reynolds, a man whose primary talent was navigating political minefields, was in full damage control mode. His first priority was to contain the story. In a brief, carefully worded press statement, he referred to the event as a regrettable misunderstanding that was under thorough internal review. He stressed that Officer Miller was a decorated officer with a solid service record. The strategy was clear: minimize, downplay, and defend. The department was closing ranks, the blue wall of silence descending as protocol dictated. They were treating it as a public relations problem, not a profound violation of civil rights. But there was one witness they hadn't accounted for, a witness that couldn't be intimidated, couldn't be influenced by union lawyers, and had no loyalty to the badge. It was the Bright Mart's state-of-the-art, high-definition, multi-angle security camera system. Mr. Henderson, the store's owner, was an elderly but tech-savvy man who had recently invested in the best system money could buy after a minor shoplifting incident a year prior. When he received a call from an internal affairs detective requesting the footage from the previous afternoon, he readily complied. He liked Elijah, who was by far his most reliable employee. The idea that anyone could mistake him for a criminal was, to Mr. Henderson, utterly preposterous. The footage was delivered to the Internal Affairs Division later that morning. Captain Davies, a veteran detective with a reputation for being thorough, sat down in a small, windowless viewing room to watch it. He had already read Officer Miller's statement. Now, he would see the objective truth. He pressed play. The primary camera, positioned high in a corner overlooking the checkout counter, provided a crystal-clear, wide-angle view of the entire interaction. There was no audio, but the video alone told a devastating story. It showed Elijah calmly and methodically stocking shelves. It showed him looking up with a polite smile as Miller entered. There were no furtive movements, no signs of agitation. It showed Elijah keeping his hands in plain sight on the counter, exactly as a cooperative citizen would. The footage starkly contradicted every key point in Miller's statement. Miller had claimed Elijah was evasive. The camera showed him standing still, answering questions. Miller had claimed Elijah's hands were near the register in a threatening way. The camera showed his hands were flat on the counter, palms up, in a gesture of non-aggression. Miller's report implied a tense, escalating situation that required him to use force. The camera showed a calm young man being aggressively confronted and then arrested by an officer for no discernible reason. A second camera angle from behind the counter was even more damning. It captured a close-up of Elijah's face. There was no defiance, no malice. There was only confusion, which slowly morphed into fear as he realized the officer was not listening to reason. Captain Davies watched the moment of the arrest 3 times. He saw Miller grab Elijah's arm, twist it behind his back, and apply the handcuffs. There was no resistance from Elijah, not even a flinch. He simply complied, his face a mask of shocked disbelief. Davies then watched the arrival of his boss, Chief Evelyn Davis. He saw the horror dawn on her face and the subsequent catastrophic realization on Miller's. The footage was irrefutable. It was a clean, unambiguous record of a wrongful arrest, rooted in what could only be described as profound prejudice. There was no misunderstanding. There was no gray area. This was a clear-cut case of an officer abusing his authority. When Chief Davis arrived at the precinct later that day, not as the chief but as Elijah's mother, to provide her own statement, Captain Davies met her in a private conference room. He slid a laptop across the table. "Chief," he said, his voice grave, "before you say anything, you need to see this." Evelyn watched the silent video, her hands clenched into fists beneath the table. She saw her son's polite smile vanish. She saw the fear in his eyes. She saw the officer's unearned aggression, and she saw the cold, hard proof that Miller's official report was a work of fiction. The video was more than just evidence. It was a weapon. The department's strategy to downplay the incident, to frame it as a simple mistake, had just been obliterated. The blue wall had crumbled, breached by the unblinking, infallible eye of a security camera. Evelyn knew the internal affairs process would continue, but she also knew it would be a slow, bureaucratic grind, likely ending in a slap on the wrist for Miller. That was not justice. As she watched the footage for a second time, a new resolve hardened within her. This wasn't just about discipline. This was about accountability, and she knew she couldn't get that from within. She needed an outside force, someone who wasn't afraid to challenge the very institution she led. The name of a lawyer came to mind. A brilliant, tenacious civil rights attorney who had a reputation for taking on impossible cases and winning. Her name was Ava Ramirez. Ava Ramirez's office was not in one of the city's gleaming downtown skyscrapers. It was a modest second-floor walk-up in a historic brick building, the kind of place where the floors creaked and the windows rattled. But from this unassuming headquarters, Ava had waged some of the most significant legal battles against police misconduct and civil rights violations the state had ever seen. She was in her late 40s, with a sharp, analytical mind and a passionate fire for justice that had not dimmed with time. She had a reputation for being relentless, for digging deeper than anyone else, and for being utterly unintimidated by the power and resources of government agencies. When she took a case, she didn't just aim to win for her client, she aimed to dismantle the system that had allowed the injustice to occur in the first place. When her assistant informed her that the chief of police was on the line, Ava was intrigued. She had crossed paths with Chief Davis professionally before, often from opposite sides of a legal issue, but she held a grudging respect for the woman. Davis was known as a reformer, a progressive leader in a profession resistant to change. The call was therefore unexpected. When Chief Davis explained, in a voice stripped of officialdom and heavy with a mother's pain, what had happened to her son, Ava listened intently, her pen flying across a legal pad. She didn't interrupt. She let the story pour out, the routine afternoon, the baseless suspicion, the handcuffs, the soul-crushing humiliation. By the time the chief finished, Ava felt a familiar, cold anger settle in her gut. It was a story she had heard in countless variations from countless clients, but the details of this case, the victim's complete innocence, the perpetrator being a police officer, and the victim's mother being the chief herself, made it a uniquely potent and explosive situation. "And there's video," Chief Davis added, her voice tight. "Crystal clear, multi-angle security footage that refutes every word of the officer's report." Ava's pen stopped. That was it. That was the fulcrum on which the entire case would pivot, an unimpeachable witness. "I'll need to see it," Ava said, her voice all business now. "And I'll need to meet with you and your son. Can you be here tomorrow morning?" The next day, Evelyn and Elijah sat in Ava's conference room. The office was filled with law books and framed newspaper clippings detailing past victories, a testament to a career spent fighting for the underdog. Elijah was quiet, withdrawn. He recounted the events of that afternoon in a low, flat voice, his eyes fixed on a spot on the mahogany table. Ava listened with a practiced empathy, asking gentle but precise questions, drawing out details he might have overlooked. She saw the lingering trauma in him, the way he flinched slightly when she mentioned the handcuffs. Then, she played the security footage on a large monitor. For Elijah, seeing the event play out from an objective, third-person perspective was a surreal and painful experience. But for Ava, it was a revelation. She watched it with the dispassionate eye of a legal strategist. She saw what a jury would see. She saw an officer operating on pure, unadulterated bias. She saw a young man who was a model of perfect conduct in the face of unwarranted aggression. She saw an abuse of power so blatant, so textbook, that it was almost shocking in its clarity. When the video ended, she turned to them. "The internal affairs investigation will likely result in a suspension for the officer, maybe some mandatory retraining," she stated bluntly. "The department will call it swift and appropriate action, and they'll hope the story goes away. That is not justice. That is damage control." She leaned forward, her gaze intense. "What happened to you, Elijah, wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a violation of your constitutional rights, specifically your Fourth Amendment right to be free from unreasonable seizure. Officer Miller had no probable cause, not even a reasonable suspicion to detain you, let alone arrest you." She turned her attention to Evelyn. "Chief, I know your position, but this case is bigger than just one bad officer. This is about a culture. Miller felt empowered to act this way because the system he works in has time and again shown him that he can. The real fight isn't just to get him fired. The real fight is to force the department to change the policies and the culture that created him." Ava laid out her strategy. They would file a Section 1983 federal civil rights lawsuit. They would name Officer Miller individually, but they would also name the city and the police department as defendants. They would argue that this wasn't just the action of a rogue cop, but the result of a systemic failure. A failure to train, a failure to supervise, and a failure to discipline. "It will be a long, difficult fight," Ava warned them. "They will attack Elijah's character. They will accuse you, Chief, of using your position to orchestrate a vendetta. They will try to bury us in paperwork and legal maneuvers. It will be exhausting." Elijah looked up, his eyes meeting the lawyer's. For the first time since the incident, a spark of defiance flickered within him. He was tired of feeling like a victim. The thought of fighting back, of holding the people responsible accountable, was like a light in a dark tunnel. He looked at his mother, who nodded her resolute support. Then he turned back to Ava. "What do we do first?" he asked, his voice stronger than it had been in days. Ava Ramirez smiled, a thin, determined smile. It was the smile of a warrior who had just been handed a righteous cause and a powerful sword. "First," she said, "we put them on notice. We file the lawsuit, and we don't just ask for justice, we demand it." 2 weeks later, the lawsuit landed like a bombshell on the steps of the federal courthouse. The legal complaint, a meticulously crafted document over 50 pages long, was a searing indictment not only of Officer Darren Miller, but of the entire Northwood Police Department. Ava Ramirez had made a strategic decision to bypass the local news outlets and give the exclusive to a national wire service. She wanted to ensure the story wasn't contained or controlled by the city's public relations machine. The headline, which was syndicated across the country within hours, was explosive. Police chief's son sues her own department for racial profiling and wrongful arrest. The effect was instantaneous and electrifying. The story had every element of a high-stakes drama: race, power, family, and a shocking abuse of authority. News vans with satellite dishes sprouting from their roofs descended on Northwood, their reporters setting up camp outside the police department, city hall, and even the Bright Mart convenience store, which had become an unwitting landmark in a national controversy. The city was no longer a quiet suburb. It was the epicenter of a raging debate about policing in America. The city government's initial reaction was defensive and clumsy. The mayor, a man more accustomed to ribbon cuttings than to crisis management, held a press conference where he expressed full confidence in the police department and cautioned the public against a rush to judgment. He emphasized that the city would vigorously defend its officers against what he termed unsubstantiated allegations. His words, intended to project strength and control, came across as tone-deaf and dismissive, further fanning the flames of public outrage. Inside the police department, the lawsuit created deep, bitter divisions. A significant faction, staunchly supported by the police union, rallied behind Officer Miller. To them, he was a scapegoat, a good cop being sacrificed for political reasons. They saw the lawsuit as a betrayal from the top, a direct attack on their profession by their own chief. The union president issued a fiery statement accusing Chief Davis of a blatant conflict of interest and of throwing her own officer to the wolves to protect her family. The sentiment in the locker rooms was one of resentment and paranoia. Cops began to second-guess every stop, every interaction, fearing that they too could end up like Miller, their careers destroyed by a single complaint. On the other side were a smaller, quieter group of officers who had long been troubled by the department's culture and by cops like Miller. They saw the lawsuit as a necessary, if painful, reckoning. They believed that Miller's actions had tarnished the badge for all of them, and that true reform was impossible without accountability. But these officers largely remained silent, afraid of the professional repercussions of breaking the blue wall of silence. The community itself fractured along predictable lines. Protesters, organized by local civil rights groups and student activists from Elijah's college, began holding daily rallies outside the police station. They carried signs with slogans like "Justice for Elijah" and "Bias is not a gut feeling." They chanted the names of other victims of police violence and demanded sweeping changes to the department. Elijah, though he shied away from the cameras, became a reluctant symbol of the movement. His clean record, his status as a college student, and his calm demeanor in the video made him an incredibly sympathetic victim. challenging the stereotypes often used to discredit those who complain of police misconduct. Counter-protesters, composed largely of Back the Blue advocates and residents who feared that the criticism of the police would lead to rising crime, organized their own rallies. They waved American flags and held signs supporting Officer Miller. The two groups often found themselves shouting at each other across barricades set up by the very police department at the center of the controversy, turning the streets of Northwood into a theater of the nation's deepest social divisions. For Elijah and Evelyn, life became a whirlwind. Their home was besieged by reporters. Evelyn faced immense pressure from the city manager and the mayor to resign, or at least take a leave of absence, to quell the political firestorm. She refused. In her mind, stepping down would be an admission of guilt and would be seen as abandoning the fight for her son. Elijah, meanwhile, tried to maintain some semblance of a normal life, but it was impossible. His face was on every news channel. He was recognized everywhere he went. Some people offered words of support, but others stared at him with open hostility, muttering about lawsuits and disrespect for the police. He had to drop 2 of his classes because the stress and anxiety made it impossible to concentrate. The incident, which had lasted only a few minutes, was now casting a long, dark shadow over every aspect of his life. Ava Ramirez, however, thrived in the chaos. She was a master at using the media to shape the public narrative. She gave a series of calm, powerful interviews, methodically laying out the facts of the case. And her trump card was the video. Against the city's legal objections, she successfully petitioned a federal judge to allow the release of the security footage to the public. The video went viral instantly. Millions of people watched the silent, damning footage of a calm, innocent young man being arrested for no reason. It was no longer an allegation. It was an undeniable fact, playing on a loop on screens across the world. The city's narrative of a misunderstanding was shattered beyond repair. The lawsuit had done more than just start a legal battle. It had ignited a city and forced a national conversation. And with the video now in the public domain, the pressure for the truth to come out was becoming unbearable. With the lawsuit filed and the court of public opinion raging, Ava Ramirez and her small legal team began the arduous, unglamorous work of legal discovery. This was the phase of the lawsuit where they could formally demand evidence from the city and the police department, documents, emails, records, and files that were normally shielded from public view. Ava's first move was to subpoena Officer Darren Miller's entire personnel file, from his first day at the academy to the present. The city's lawyers fought back, citing privacy concerns and officer safety, but the federal judge, seeing the clear relevance of the file to a case alleging a pattern of behavior, ordered them to produce it. When the file arrived, a thick, heavy binder filled with hundreds of pages of reports, commendations, and complaints, it was like an archaeological dig into Miller's career. On the surface, it supported the department's narrative. Miller had received several commendations for arrests and had consistently received satisfactory or exceeds expectations on his performance reviews. His supervisors praised his proactive nature and his high level of activity on patrol. But Ava knew that in policing, terms like proactive and active could often be code for something else entirely. She was looking for what was written between the lines. Her team began to cross-reference every traffic stop, every field interview, and every arrest Miller had made in the past 5 years with the city's demographic data. A clear and disturbing pattern began to emerge. While Miller patrolled a district that was over 70% white, more than 80% of his discretionary stops not related to a moving violation like speeding, involved minority drivers. The disparity was too vast to be explained by chance. It was a statistical portrait of racial bias. Deeper within the file, buried among the commendations, were the citizen complaints. There were 7 of them over an 8-year career. To the department, This was an acceptably low number. To Ava, it was a trail of breadcrumbs. Each complaint had been investigated by Internal Affairs and had been classified as unfounded or exonerated, meaning the investigation concluded that the officer's actions were justified. But the narratives of the complaints themselves were strikingly similar. A black businessman pulled over and subjected to an aggressive, accusatory search of his luxury car. A Latino college professor detained for looking suspicious while jogging in a wealthy neighborhood. An interracial couple repeatedly questioned about their relationship during a simple traffic stop. In each case, Miller's justification was the same. He had a gut feeling. He observed furtive movements. He sensed uncooperative behavior. These were the same vague, subjective reasons he had used to justify his actions against Elijah. And in each case, the department had sided with its officer over the word of a citizen. The complaints were not seen as red flags indicating a problem with an officer's conduct. They were treated as nuisances, the unavoidable cost of proactive policing. No disciplinary action had ever been taken. No counseling or retraining had ever been recommended. The system hadn't just failed to correct Miller's behavior, it had actively enabled it by consistently validating his prejudiced instincts. Ava's team took the names from those 7 complaints and began to track the individuals down. Some had moved away, others were reluctant to get involved, fearing retribution. But 2 of them agreed to talk. One was Dr. Alistair Finch, a respected history professor at the local university. He recounted with a voice still filled with indignation how Miller had pulled him over, accused him of casing houses while on his morning run, and forced him to sit on a curb for nearly an hour while his identity was verified. He looked at my university ID as if it were a forgery, Dr. Finch told Ava. The condescension, the immediate presumption of guilt. It was utterly dehumanizing. I filed a complaint, but I never heard anything back. It felt like shouting into a void. The other was a young woman named Sarah Jenkins, a graphic designer who had been pulled over by Miller for a broken tail light, which, miraculously, was working perfectly when she checked it later. Miller had questioned her for 20 minutes about where she was going and what she was doing in this part of town, his tone accusatory and intimidating. He made me feel like a criminal in my own neighborhood, she said. After I filed the complaint and it was dismissed, I just felt powerless. I'm glad someone is finally standing up to him. These stories were powerful. They established that what happened to Elijah was not an isolated incident, not a one-time mistake. It was a predictable outcome of an officer's well-established pattern of targeting minorities based on suspicion rather than evidence. Ava knew that Miller's lawyers would argue that his past conduct was irrelevant to this specific case. But she was preparing a different argument. She would argue that the department's failure to act on these prior complaints, their deliberate indifference to a clear pattern of misconduct, made them directly liable for what happened to Elijah. They had been warned that Officer Miller was a problem. They had ignored the warnings, and now the consequences had arrived on their doorstep in the form of a federal lawsuit that threatened to expose not just the prejudice of one officer, but the negligence of the entire department. The personnel file, intended to be a record of a satisfactory career, had become the blueprint for their prosecution. As the legal team continued to analyze Officer Miller's record, Ava Ramirez broadened the scope of her investigation. Her goal was to prove that Miller wasn't just a single bad apple, but rather the predictable product of a poisoned tree. She filed a new, sweeping discovery request, demanding access to the Northwood Police Department's training materials, policy manuals, and internal communications related to use of force, de-escalation, and anti-bias training over the past decade. The city's lawyers fought this request even more fiercely than they had the request for Miller's personnel file. They argued it was an irrelevant fishing expedition designed to harass the department. But again, the judge sided with Ava, ruling that the department's training and policies were directly relevant to the claim of systemic failure. When the documents arrived, they came in dozens of heavy boxes, a mountain of paper that represented the department's institutional soul. Ava and her team of paralegals spent weeks sifting through the bureaucratic jargon and redacted pages, searching for the policies and cultural norms that had allowed an officer like Miller to flourish. What they found was not a policy of explicit racism, but something far more insidious. A culture of ambiguity and a system that prioritized aggressive enforcement over constitutional protections. The training materials on identifying suspicious behavior were a case study in vagueness. They instructed officers to look for individuals who appear out of place, who avoid eye contact, or who exhibit unusual nervousness. These were subjective criteria that were, in effect, a blank check for officers to act on their personal biases. For an officer predisposed to see a black teenager in a predominantly white neighborhood as out of place, these materials didn't challenge that bias. They validated it as a legitimate policing tactic. The guidelines gave prejudice the veneer of professional training. The de-escalation training modules were shockingly brief and superficial. They consisted of a few PowerPoint slides and a short multiple-choice test. In contrast, the training on use of force and tactical maneuvers was extensive, hands-on, and heavily emphasized. The message was clear. The department paid lip service to talking people down, but it invested its real time and resources in teaching officers how to take them down. An officer's ability to control a situation through physical dominance was valued far more than their ability to resolve it through communication. But the most damning evidence came from the internal emails that Ava's team subpoenaed. They requested all communications from Miller's direct supervisors, particularly Sergeant Frank Doyle, pertaining to performance evaluations and patrol strategies. The emails painted a grim picture of the department's internal culture. In one email chain, Sergeant Doyle praised his shift for its high number of field interviews and proactive stops, urging them to keep the numbers up to show command they were being aggressive on crime. There was no mention of whether these stops were legally justified or whether they were leading to actual arrests. The metric for success was activity for activity's sake. Officers were being incentivized to stop and question as many people as possible, a practice that inevitably leads to profiling. In another particularly shocking email, a fellow officer forwarded a civilian complaint against Miller to Sergeant Doyle with a joking comment. "Looks like Miller ruffled some more feathers." Doyle's reply was not one of concern, but of cynical amusement. "Tell the complainant we'll give it the attention it deserves," he wrote, followed by a winking emoji. The email was a smoking gun, proof that supervisors were not only aware of Miller's aggressive tactics, but privately mocked the citizens who dared to complain about them. It showed a culture of contempt, a belief that officers were soldiers in a war against a hostile public, and that complaints were just the whining of the enemy. Ava's team also uncovered performance reviews where Sergeant Doyle had specifically commended Miller for his instincts and his ability to identify potential threats before they materialize. These were the very instincts that had led to the wrongful arrest of Elijah Davis. Far from being a rogue officer, Miller was, in fact, the model officer by his department's own standards. He was doing exactly what his supervisors were encouraging him to do. He was aggressive, he was active, and he didn't let political correctness get in the way of his gut feelings. This evidence fundamentally shifted the narrative of the lawsuit. It was no longer just about Elijah Davis versus Officer Miller. It was about a group of citizens versus a police department that had systematically failed in its most basic duties. Ava's legal argument was now crystal clear. The department had created a culture that rewarded biased policing. It had trained its officers using vague and discriminatory guidelines, and its supervisors had actively encouraged and covered for the very behavior that led to the violation of Elijah's rights. The rot wasn't in a single apple. It was in the core of the barrel itself, and Ava Ramirez now had the documents to prove it. The national media attention on Elijah's lawsuit had an unintended, powerful side effect. It acted as a beacon for others who had been silently nursing their own wounds from encounters with Officer Miller and the Northwood PD. Seeing the case play out on a national stage and seeing someone with the standing of the police chief's son fighting back gave them courage. The trickle of calls to Ava Ramirez's office soon became a steady stream. They were voices from the past, victims of incidents that had been dismissed and forgotten by the department, but never by the people who had lived through them. Ava and her team meticulously vetted each story, separating credible accounts from opportunistic claims. A clear and undeniable pattern solidified, corroborating the evidence they had found in the official documents. The stories were all variations on the same theme. Miller targeting a person of color who did not fit his narrow, prejudiced view of who belonged in the quiet suburbs of Northwood. One of the most compelling voices belonged to Marcus Thorne, a successful software engineer in his late 30s. A year before Elijah's arrest, Marcus had been driving home from a late night at the office in his new BMW. He was pulled over by Officer Miller. The official reason was that he had failed to signal a lane change early enough. But the pretext quickly fell away. Miller approached the car with his hand on his weapon, his flashlight beam directed not at the license plate, but directly into Marcus's eyes. He ordered Marcus out of the car, his questions dripping with insinuation. "Whose car is this? Where did you get the money for a car like this? What are you really doing in this neighborhood at this hour?" Marcus, who had never had so much as a speeding ticket, was stunned. He tried to explain that he lived just a few blocks away, that he was a homeowner, a taxpayer. Miller seemed to take his success as a personal affront. He subjected Marcus to a field sobriety test, which he passed easily, and then spent nearly 45 minutes searching his car, pulling up floor mats and emptying the glove compartment, all while Marcus was forced to stand on the sidewalk under the glare of the patrol car's headlights. Miller found nothing. He eventually let Marcus go with a grudging warning, but the experience left a deep scar. "It wasn't about the law," Marcus told Ava, his voice still shaking with remembered anger. "It was about humiliation. He needed to put me in my place, to remind me that no matter how successful I became, to him, I would always be a suspect." Another powerful story came from a couple, David and Maria Chen, a respected architect and a pediatrician. They had been in the process of buying a home in Northwood and were taking a walk through their prospective neighborhood one sunny weekend afternoon. Officer Miller's cruiser screeched to a halt beside them. He demanded their identification and questioned them for 20 minutes about what they were doing there. His questions were directed almost exclusively at Maria, who was Latina. He asked if she was a domestic worker in the area, if she was with David, his tone implying she couldn't possibly belong there on her own terms. The experience was so jarring and offensive that they withdrew their offer on the house the next day. "We wanted to raise our children in a community where they would feel safe, where they would be seen as neighbors, not intruders," Maria explained to Ava's paralegal, tears welling in her eyes. That officer showed us that Northwood was not that place. These stories, and others like them, were more than just anecdotes. They were powerful human testimonies that breathed life into the dry statistics and bureaucratic documents Ava had compiled. She decided to formally add Marcus Thorne and the Chens to the lawsuit as additional plaintiffs. This transformed the case from a single incident into a class action lawsuit, representing a collective of citizens who had been systematically targeted and harassed. It dramatically increased the legal and financial pressure on the city. They were no longer defending against one unfortunate mistake. They were now facing a documented history of discriminatory policing. The inclusion of these new voices had a profound impact on the public perception of the case. It became much harder for the police union and Miller's defenders to paint Elijah's arrest as a one-off event. The media began running stories featuring interviews with Marcus and Maria, their articulate and heartfelt accounts of their experiences resonating deeply with the public. They were successful, respected professionals, the kind of model citizens whose credibility was beyond reproach. Their testimony systematically dismantled the narrative that Miller was simply targeting troublemakers. It proved that his real targets were minorities whose very presence and success seemed to offend his sense of order. The chorus of victims was growing louder, and their collective voice was becoming impossible for the city to ignore. Within the sterile, guarded walls of the Northwood Police Department, the lawsuit had created a toxic atmosphere of suspicion and division. Officers who had once been partners now eyed each other warily across the briefing room. The pressure to pick a side was immense. The union was adamant in its defense of Miller, demanding absolute loyalty from its members. To publicly question Miller's actions was to betray the brotherhood, to break the unspoken code that protected them all. Yet, for some, the silence was becoming a burden too heavy to bear. One of those officers was Ben Carter. At 28, he was younger than Miller, but had been on the force for a respectable 5 years. He was quiet, observant, and had joined the police force with a genuine, if somewhat naive, desire to help people. He had worked several shifts with Miller in the past and had always been unsettled by his partner's cynicism and his quickness to judge. Carter had witnessed firsthand Miller's habit of targeting minority drivers for minor infractions that he would ignore from white drivers. He had heard the casual, derogatory remarks Miller would make after an encounter. Carter had told himself it was just Miller's way, that it didn't reflect on him or the department as a whole. But the Elijah Davis case had shattered that comforting illusion. Carter had seen the security footage, everyone in the department had seen it, and it was undeniable. There was no justification for what Miller had done. It was a raw abuse of power, and the department's subsequent attempt to defend it, to label it a misunderstanding, struck Carter as a profound moral failure. He listened to his colleagues in the locker room defending Miller, complaining about the political witch hunt, and he felt a growing sense of alienation. This wasn't the job he had signed up for. He had sworn an oath to uphold the Constitution, not to protect crooked cops. His crisis of conscience came to a head one evening when he overheard Sergeant Doyle, Miller's supervisor, holding court in the break room. Doyle was laughing with a few other veteran officers about the lawsuit. "The kid's a genius," Doyle said with a smirk, referring to Miller. "He arrests the one kid in the entire city whose mom can actually fire him. You can't make this stuff up." The other officers chuckled. The conversation then turned to how they would handle the investigation, with Doyle boasting that Internal Affairs knew how to play ball, and that Miller would be back on the street in a few months after the hysteria dies down. Listening to them, Carter felt sick to his stomach. This wasn't just a cover-up, it was a joke to them. The trauma inflicted on Elijah, the damage done to the community's trust, the stain on their own department, it was all just fodder for a cynical laugh. He realized in that moment that staying silent was no longer a neutral act. It was an act of complicity. He went home that night and couldn't sleep. He thought about his own young son. What if it had been him? What if he had been the one wrongly accused, handcuffed, and humiliated, only to have the system he was taught to trust mock his suffering? The next day, with his heart pounding and his hands clammy, Ben Carter made a decision that he knew would irrevocably alter the course of his life and career. He used a burner phone to make an anonymous call. He didn't call Internal Affairs, and he didn't call the deputy chief. He called the one person he believed might actually use the information to pursue genuine justice, Ava Ramirez. "You don't know me," he said when she answered, his voice low and tense. "I'm an officer with the Northwood PD, and I have information about the Elijah Davis case. Information that proves this isn't just about Miller. It's about his supervisors. It's about a cover-up." Ava, who received her fair share of crank calls, listened with a practiced skepticism. But there was a sincerity, a desperate urgency in the man's voice that made her pay attention. "What kind of information?" she asked, her voice calm and encouraging. "More than you know," Carter replied. "Things that aren't in the documents, things that were said, things that were done. But I can't talk on the phone, and no one can know who I am. If they find out, my career is over. Or worse." Ava's legal instincts went on high alert. This was it. This was the break every trial lawyer dreams of. A voice from the inside, a conscience in a blue uniform, a whistleblower ready to tear down the wall of silence from within. "Tell me where and when," she said. "I'll be there." The meeting was set for a neutral location, a quiet corner of a public library in a neighboring town. Ben Carter arrived looking like any other civilian, wearing a hoodie and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. He was visibly nervous, constantly scanning the room. Ava Ramirez found him sitting at a secluded table, a book open in front of him that he wasn't reading. She sat down opposite him, her demeanor calm and reassuring. "Thank you for coming," she said softly. Carter took a deep breath. "I don't know if I'm doing the right thing," he confessed. "These guys, they're my colleagues. But what I saw, what I've heard, it's just wrong." Ava simply nodded, letting him speak. She knew that for a whistleblower, the act of speaking out was often as difficult as the information they were revealing. Carter then told her everything. He told her about Miller's long-standing reputation for targeting minorities. He told her about Sergeant Doyle's explicit encouragement of high-activity policing, regardless of legal justification. He described the cynical, dismissive culture among his superiors, who treated citizen complaints as a joke. This was all valuable information, a powerful insider's confirmation of what Ava's investigation had already uncovered. It would make his testimony, even as an anonymous witness, incredibly compelling. But then, Carter revealed his trump card. "There's more," he said, reaching into his jacket pocket. "A few months ago, after a couple of questionable stops that Miller made, I started to worry. I started recording some of the conversations in the patrol car and back at the station, just for my own protection, in case something went bad and they tried to blame me." He pulled out a small, discreet digital audio recorder and placed it on the table. "I have him," Carter said, his voice barely a whisper. "I have Miller, after the incident with Elijah, bragging about it." Ava's heart leaped. This was beyond anything she could have hoped for. An audio recording was not a matter of interpretation or a case of one person's word against another. It was a permanent, irrefutable record. "Let me hear it," she said. Carter pressed a button, and the small device came to life. The audio was slightly muffled, the sound of a car's engine humming in the background, but the voices were clear. It was a recording from Miller's patrol car, apparently made just an hour or two after the incident at the Bright Mart, before he knew the chief was Elijah's mother. He was talking to his partner from a different shift, who had called to ask what happened. Miller's voice on the recording was a chilling cocktail of arrogance and contempt. "You should have seen this kid," Miller laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Mr. College boy, working at a convenience store. He tried to give me all this lip about, 'I work here, sir,' all polite and proper. Thought he was better than me." The other officer on the call asked if the kid had been resisting. "Nah, that's the beauty of it," Miller boasted. "I didn't even have to rough him up. Just seeing the cuffs go on him. The look on his face when he realized all his fancy words didn't mean squat. It was perfect. A little lesson in respect. A reminder of who's really in charge out here." Ava felt a cold fury wash over her as she listened. The recording was a direct refutation of the department's entire defense. Their narrative was that Miller had made a good-faith mistake. They claimed he had perceived a legitimate threat and had acted professionally, if mistakenly. But the voice on this recording was not the voice of an officer who had made a mistake. It was the voice of a man who had intentionally, maliciously, and with great personal satisfaction abused his power to humiliate a young man he disliked on sight. He wasn't trying to stop a crime, he was teaching a lesson. He wasn't mistaken, he was malicious. The recording proved beyond any doubt the legal standard for punitive damages. That Miller had acted with malice or reckless indifference to Elijah's constitutional rights. Carter had more. A second recording captured Sergeant Doyle talking to Miller after he found out about the chief's involvement. Doyle wasn't admonishing Miller for his actions. He was coaching him on how to write his report. "You gotta frame it right, Darren," Doyle's voice advised. "Use the magic words, furtive movements, concern for officer safety, subject was uncooperative. We'll say the kid's story was inconsistent. Internal Affairs knows the drill. We'll protect you." This second recording proved a conspiracy to cover up the incident and file a false report, implicating management directly in the wrongdoing. Ava knew these recordings were the key to blowing the case wide open. They were the smoking gun, the silver bullet. They would destroy Miller's credibility on the stand and expose the corruption of his supervisors. She looked at Ben Carter, a young officer who had risked everything to do the right thing. "You have no idea what you've just done," she told him, her voice filled with a new, unshakable confidence. "You've just given Elijah his justice." The city's lawyers could argue about statistics. They could debate training manuals. But there was no way they could ever explain away the sheer, unadulterated malice in Officer Miller's own voice. Ava Ramirez did not use the secret recordings immediately. A weapon this powerful had to be deployed at the moment of maximum impact. She submitted the audio files to the court under seal, a legal maneuver that prevented the city's lawyers from hearing them right away, but formally entered them as evidence to be used at trial. However, she had her paralegal transcribe the most damning excerpts. These transcripts, stripped of their sourcing to protect her whistleblower, were then strategically leaked to the same national news reporter who had broken the initial story. The effect was cataclysmic. Reading Officer Miller's own words, his gloating, his contempt, his admission that he was teaching Elijah a lesson in respect, was even more visceral and horrifying for the public than watching the silent video. The audio transcript stripped away any last lingering defense that this was a simple mistake. It laid bare the ugly, prejudiced malice that had motivated the arrest. The story exploded, going from a major national news item to an all-consuming political firestorm. The mayor, who had previously offered a weak defense of the police department, was now facing a full-blown crisis. His office was inundated with calls from furious citizens. Protesters, their numbers now swelling into the thousands, surrounded City Hall day and night. Their chants were no longer just "Justice for Elijah." They were now "Fire Miller" and "Doyle must go." The City Council, a body of politicians exquisitely sensitive to shifts in public opinion, began to turn on the mayor and the police leadership. They scheduled an emergency public session to address the crisis. The session, broadcast on live television, was a brutal, televised spectacle. One by one, furious citizens stepped up to the microphone to share their own stories of police harassment and to demand accountability. Civil rights leaders, religious figures, and community activists condemned the department's culture. The council members, sensing the direction of the political winds, grilled Deputy Chief Reynolds, who had been sent to represent the department in Chief Davis's absence from the chain of command. Reynolds, visibly sweating under the hot television lights, had no good answers. He mumbled bureaucratic platitudes about ongoing investigations and personnel matters, but his words were drowned out by the angry shouts of the crowd. The political pressure became unbearable. The transcripts of Sergeant Doyle coaching Miller on how to falsify his report were particularly toxic. It demonstrated a level of corruption that went beyond a single officer. It pointed to a rot in the department's leadership. Editorials in the local and national papers began calling for a wholesale house cleaning. They argued that the problems in Northwood were clearly systemic and could not be solved by firing one officer. They demanded the resignation of Sergeant Doyle, Deputy Chief Reynolds, and any other supervisor who had enabled this culture of abuse. Several prominent members of Congress from the state weighed in, expressing their deep concern and calling for the Department of Justice to open a federal pattern and practice investigation into the Northwood Police Department. The threat of a federal takeover, which would be a monumental humiliation for the city, put even more pressure on the mayor. His political career was on the verge of collapse. He had to be seen as taking decisive action. Behind the scenes, the city's lawyers were in a state of panic. The leaked transcripts had crippled their legal strategy. They knew that if a jury ever heard those recordings, the city would not only lose the case, but would likely be hit with punitive damages so massive they could bankrupt the municipal budget. The leverage had completely shifted. Ava Ramirez held all the cards. The city attorney's office advised the mayor that taking the case to trial would be an act of fiscal and political suicide. Their only viable option was to settle. The mayor, seeing his administration crumbling around him, finally caved. He held another press conference. This time his tone was not defensive, but somber and apologetic. He announced that the city would be opening settlement negotiations with Elijah Davis's attorneys immediately. He also announced that, pending the outcome of the internal affairs investigation, the city had begun termination proceedings against Officer Darren Miller. Finally, he announced that Sergeant Frank Doyle and Deputy Chief Mark Reynolds had both been placed on administrative leave, and he was formally requesting their resignations. It was a stunning capitulation, a complete reversal of the city's initial position. The political firestorm, ignited by the chilling words on a secret recording, had become so intense that it had forced the city to its knees. The fight was not over, but the battle for accountability had been decisively won. The settlement negotiations took place in a sterile, impersonal conference room at a neutral law firm, halfway between Ava Ramirez's office and City Hall. The atmosphere was thick with tension. On one side of the massive, polished table sat Ava, her lead paralegal, and Elijah Davis. Elijah was there at Ava's insistence. She wanted the city's representatives to look the young man they had wronged in the eye. On the other side sat the city's lead attorney, a high-priced lawyer from an outside firm hired for damage control, along with a representative from the city's insurance carrier, a man whose face was a permanent mask of grim calculation. The city's opening offer was a clear signal that they were still underestimating Ava's resolve. The lawyer slid a piece of paper across the table. It was an offer for $500,000. "This is a generous offer, Ms. Ramirez," the lawyer said smoothly. "It will more than compensate Mr. Davis for any inconvenience he may have experienced, and it will allow all of us to put this unfortunate incident behind us." Ava didn't even look at the paper. She looked at the insurance adjuster, the man who was truly in charge of the money. "An inconvenience?" she repeated, her voice dangerously quiet. "Your police department, acting under the color of law, wrongfully arrested, handcuffed, and humiliated this young man based on nothing but racial prejudice. Your officer's supervisor then conspired to cover it up with a falsified report. We have it on tape, and you call that an inconvenience?" She pushed the paper back across the table. "We are not here to be insulted. Your offer is rejected." The city's lawyer tried to argue, pointing out that Elijah had no significant physical injuries and that a jury might not be as sympathetic as she thought. Ava let him finish, then calmly laid out her case as if she were giving her opening statement to a jury. She talked about the emotional distress, the psychological trauma, the damage to Elijah's reputation, and the interruption of his education. She detailed the clear, documented pattern of misconduct by Miller and the department's deliberate indifference to it. Then she played her ace. "And then there are the punitive damages," she said, her eyes locking with the insurance adjusters. "When the jury hears your officer in his own voice bragging about humiliating a young man to teach him a lesson, what number do you think they will write on that verdict form? 7 figures? 8? 9? This isn't just about compensating Elijah. This is about punishing a city that allowed its police force to become a breeding ground for prejudice. We have the recordings. We have the whistleblower. We have a dozen other victims ready to testify. You are not negotiating from a position of strength. You are negotiating to avoid a catastrophe." The insurance adjuster, who had been silent up to this point, finally spoke. "What do you want, Ms. Ramirez?" Ava slid her own piece of paper across the table. It contained 2 sections. The first was the financial demand, $20 million. A gasp came from the city's side of the table. The lawyer called the figure outrageous and absurd. But the insurance adjuster didn't flinch. He was doing the math in his head, weighing the certainty of a massive settlement against the possibility of an even more massive, uncapped jury verdict. But it was the second section of Ava's demand that was the true sticking point. It was a list of non-negotiable institutional reforms. It demanded the complete overhaul of the department's training on use of force and identifying suspicious behavior. It mandated the creation of a new, independent civilian oversight board with the power to investigate and discipline officers. It required the department to implement a sophisticated early warning system to identify officers like Miller with a high number of citizen complaints. It demanded mandatory, annual, and intensive anti-bias training for every single officer on the force, from the rookies to the chief. And it demanded that the settlement agreement, including all the reform clauses, be made a public document, enforceable by a federal judge. "The money is for Elijah," Ava stated firmly. "The reforms are for every other person in this city, so that what happened to him never happens again. We will not accept one without the other. This is a package deal." The city's lawyer argued that they couldn't agree to such sweeping policy changes as part of a settlement. He claimed it was an overreach, an infringement on the city's right to manage its own police force. But Ava held her ground. She knew that financial compensation without systemic change was a hollow victory. It would pay a victim, but it wouldn't fix the problem. The department would just write a check and go right back to business as usual. The negotiations stalled. The city's team asked for a break to confer. Ava and Elijah sat in the conference room alone. "Are you sure about this?" Elijah asked quietly. "20 million it's a lot of money. Maybe we should just take it." Ava turned to him. "Elijah, this was never just about the money. We have a chance right now to force real, lasting change. A chance to protect other kids from going through what you went through. Are you willing to walk away from that?" Elijah thought for a long moment. He thought about Marcus Thorne, the Chens, and the countless others who might not have a mother who was the police chief or a lawyer like Ava. He thought about the responsibility that had been thrust upon him. He straightened his shoulders. "No," he said, his voice firm. "You're right. We fight for all of it." When the city's team returned to the room, the grim looks on their faces told Ava everything she needed to know. The battle in the conference room was over. They were ready to surrender. The final settlement agreement was signed 3 weeks later. It was a document that would not only change the course of Elijah Davis's life, but would forever alter the landscape of policing in the city of Northwood. The city, faced with the overwhelming evidence and the certainty of a disastrous public trial, had agreed to nearly all of Ava Ramirez's terms. The financial component of the settlement was staggering. The city and its insurers agreed to pay Elijah Davis $18.5 million. It was one of the largest pre-trial settlements for a single plaintiff civil rights case in the state's history. The number was deliberately high, designed not just to compensate Elijah for his trauma and the disruption to his life, but to serve as a powerful, painful deterrent to the city. It was a figure that would be felt in every budget meeting for the next decade, a constant reminder of the high cost of unchecked police misconduct. The headline-grabbing number sent a clear message to municipalities across the country. Ignoring patterns of abuse and failing to train and supervise officers properly would have devastating financial consequences. But for Ava, Evelyn, and Elijah, the true victory lay in the second half of the agreement. The extensive, legally binding consent decree that mandated sweeping departmental reforms. This was the legacy of the case, the part that would endure long after the money was spent. The city agreed to disband its current training academy curriculum and work with a panel of national experts on policing reform, selected by Ava's team, to build a new program from the ground up. The new training would de-emphasize confrontational tactics and focus on de-escalation, communication, and a deep, nuanced understanding of constitutional rights and implicit bias. A permanent, fully funded civilian complaint review board was established. For the first time, citizens of Northwood would have a body independent of the police department to investigate their complaints. The board was given subpoena power and the authority to recommend disciplinary action up to and including termination directly to the chief of police. The department was also forced to invest in a new data-driven early intervention system. This software would track officer conduct, flagging individuals with a high number of use-of-force incidents, citizen complaints, or statistically skewed stop-and-frisk records. Officers flagged by the system would be automatically pulled from patrol duties for mandatory retraining and evaluation. The agreement also mandated significant changes to policy. Vague justifications for stops, like an individual looking suspicious or being out of place, were explicitly banned from official reports. Officers would now have to articulate specific evidence-based reasons for every detention. Furthermore, the department was required to diversify its hiring practices and set ambitious new goals for recruiting a police force that more accurately reflected the demographics of the community it served. A federal judge would oversee the implementation of these reforms for a period of no less than 5 years, ensuring the city could not backslide on its commitments once the media attention faded. The fallout for the individuals involved was equally decisive. Officer Darren Miller was officially fired from the Northwood Police Department. The termination, combined with the public evidence of his falsified report and malicious intent, meant his law enforcement career was over. No other department would ever hire him. Furthermore, the county's district attorney, under intense public pressure, convened a grand jury to investigate Miller for official misconduct and perjury, opening the door to criminal charges. Sergeant Frank Doyle and Deputy Chief Mark Reynolds both submitted their forced resignations, their careers ending in disgrace. The day the settlement was publicly announced, Chief Evelyn Davis held a press conference. She did not speak as a mother, but as the leader of the embattled department. She stood before the cameras and offered a stark, unequivocal apology to Elijah and to the entire community. "The Northwood Police Department failed you," she said, her voice steady and clear. "We failed in our training, we failed in our supervision, and we failed in our culture. Today marks the beginning of a new era. The reforms we have agreed to will be difficult, and they will be costly, but they are necessary. We will rebuild this department on a foundation of trust, accountability, and unwavering respect for the constitutional rights of every person we are sworn to protect." It was a powerful promise, a public acknowledgement of the department's deep-seated failures, and the first step on a long and arduous road to redemption. The settlement was not an end, but a beginning. It was the blueprint for a new way forward, purchased at a high price by a young man who had just wanted to do his job on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. In the months and years that followed the landmark settlement, the city of Northwood became a living laboratory for police reform. The changes were not immediate or seamless. There was resistance from the police union and grumbling from veteran officers who resented the new civilian oversight and the intensive retraining. But the changes were real, enforced by the unblinking oversight of a federal judge and the unwavering commitment of Chief Evelyn Davis. She used the political capital she had earned through the ordeal to clean house, promoting a new generation of leaders who were committed to the principles of constitutional policing. The culture of the department began to slowly, painstakingly shift from one of a warrior mentality to one of guardianship. Elijah Davis never went back to his job at the Bright Mart. The settlement gave him the financial freedom to pursue his education without distraction. He transferred to a prestigious 4-year university, completed his business degree with honors, and went on to earn his MBA. He used a portion of his settlement to establish a non-profit foundation dedicated to providing legal resources for victims of police misconduct and funding scholarships for minority students pursuing careers in law and public policy. He rarely spoke publicly about the incident, choosing to let his actions and his foundation's work speak for him. The trauma of that afternoon never fully disappeared. A sudden siren could still make his heart race. A police car in his rearview mirror could still trigger a wave of anxiety, but he refused to let it define him. He had transformed his pain into a purpose, his ordeal into an opportunity to help others. His relationship with his mother, Evelyn, deepened, forged in the crucible of their shared fight. They had faced the system together, one from the outside and one from the inside, and had bent it toward justice. Evelyn served as chief for 5 more years, overseeing the most critical period of the reforms, before retiring with a legacy as one of the most transformative and courageous police leaders in the country. Her career would forever be defined by the moment she had to choose between being a mother and being a chief, and had somehow managed to be both. The case of Davis versus City of Northwood became a staple in law school textbooks, a case study in how to litigate a civil rights case and achieve not just financial victory, but meaningful structural change. And the whistleblower, Ben Carter, whose courage had provided the key to unlocking the truth, was never publicly identified. As part of the settlement, Ava Ramirez ensured that the city could not launch an internal investigation to find the source of the leak. He quietly transferred to a police department in another state a year later, carrying with him the knowledge that his single act of conscience had helped topple a corrupt system and bring about a new era of accountability. The story of what happened to Elijah Davis began with a single, flawed assumption inside the mind of one man. What drove Officer Miller was not some grand theatrical evil, but something far more common and perhaps more dangerous: the quiet, corrosive power of unexamined bias. Miller likely saw himself as a protector, a guardian of a social order that felt right and familiar to him. In his worldview, a young black man in that context was a disruption to that order, a threat to be managed. His gut feeling was not a superpower. It was a prejudice, nurtured by a culture that had taught him to see suspicion instead of humanity, to value control over communication. If only he had paused for just 10 seconds to take a breath and truly listen to the calm, rational words Elijah was saying. If only the department's training had forced him to question his own assumptions rather than validating them as instincts, the entire tragedy could have been averted. For Elijah, his ordeal offers a difficult lesson. He did everything right. He was calm, polite, and non-confrontational, and it still wasn't enough to protect him. It's a chilling reminder that sometimes innocence is not a shield. If he had reacted with anger or fear, if he had argued or resisted, Miller would have used that as justification for his actions, and the clear, unambiguous narrative captured on camera would have been muddied. His survival and ultimate victory lay in his incredible composure under unimaginable pressure. It is a terrible burden to place on any citizen, the need to be perfect in the face of imperfection, to be calm in the face of aggression, just to survive an encounter with those sworn to protect you. His story underscores the vital importance of knowing your rights, but also the power of technology, the silent, objective eye of a camera that can bear witness when human eyes are clouded by prejudice. Ultimately, this story is a testament to the fact that justice is not a destination. It is a fight. It is rarely given freely. It must be demanded, fought for, and protected by ordinary people who possess extraordinary courage. The courage of a young man who refused to be broken, a mother who risked her career for her son, a lawyer who championed the powerless, and an officer who broke his code of silence to honor a higher code of morality. Their struggle reminds us that while the arc of the moral universe is long, it only bends toward justice because people like them have the strength and determination to bend it. Have you ever witnessed a situation where someone was judged unfairly based on their appearance? What does true accountability look like to you when people in power make a mistake? Share your thoughts and stories in the comments below. Your voice matters in this ongoing conversation.